Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. It is a privilege to welcome Dr. Adam Berinsky, Mitsui Professor of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Director of the MIT Political Experiments Research Lab. He is also a faculty affiliate at MIT's Institute for Data, Systems and Society. Dr. Berinsky earned his PhD in political science from the University of Michigan in 2000 and has since become one of the leading voices in the study of public opinion and political behavior. His work explores how people interpret political information, especially in times of uncertainty, conflict, and rapid change. At the heart of his research lies the critical question: why do individuals believe and continue to hold on to misinformation even after it has been debunked? His book, Political Rumors: Why We Accept Misinformation and How to Fight It, published by Princeton University Press, addresses this challenge by uncovering the psychological and social forces behind misinformation and offering practical ways to counter it. His earlier book, In Times of War and Silent Voices, have made significant contributions to our understanding of public opinion and political participation in the United States. In addition to his books, Professor Berinsky has published extensively in leading academic journals and contributes to shaping the field as a co-editor of the Chicago Studies in American Politics series. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and he has held prestigious fellowships, including the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences and the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation. In today's episode, Professor Adam Berinsky joins us to unpack the core ideas of political humors, why false political narratives persist even after being corrected, and what can be done to effectively challenge and contain them. So, without further delay, let's begin. Professor Adam, thank you for accepting our invitation. It's an honor and pleasure to welcome you to Business Talk.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your book challenges the assumption that misinformation disappears once it is debunked. Why do political rumors continue to persist even after clear factual correction?
That's great. It's a great question. And when I first started studying this almost 16 years ago now, I was just very interested in sort of seeing what was around me. Rumors about Obama, whether he was born in the US or in Kenya, Indonesia, and sort of facts would emerge, and still the rumors would persist. And so I was very interested in discovering, why this was the case. And I think in part it's because people, sort of that they don't pay much attention to politics. So most of the people, most of the time, don't pay attention to politics. So, if you correct a rumor, it's not necessarily going to stick. Someone's going to move on to the next thing. I mean, it's also the case that rumors, acquire a lot of their power through social transmission. So, you hear a rumor once, you gets debunked, you hear it again. It's really hard for people to process this. So I think a part of this is about just the information flow. You hear rumors all the time. Even if you're pushing against that, it can be very difficult to correct that. I think it's also underscores the fact that we can't just correct rumors once and then move on. So thinking that Obama, when so there were accusations that he wasn't born in the U.S., he released his birth certificate, and at that time the rumors went away for a little while, but then people forgot. They came back. So I think what's really important is to be vigilant about rumor correction, to recognize we can't just play. So I talk about a game in the U.S. whack-a-mole, where I don't know if it translates culturally, but different things pop up and you hit them with a hammer and it pop up again. You can't just hit it once. You need to keep hitting the rumor again and again.
Professor, book distinguishes political rumors from related concepts like misinformation and conspiracy theories at the
Yeah.
conceptual level. How does that distinction shape the way you design your experiments and interpret public opinion data across the chapters that follow?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of commonalities there. So, when we think about conspiracy theories, misinformation, urban legends, like the kinds of stories that school kids tell each other. That a lot of this has to do with the repetition and transmission. So, when I teach about misinformation and political rumors, I talk about it. So, when I was a kid, there were rumors that McDonald's hamburgers had worms in them. I tell my students this, and they say, "Oh, no, no, that's Wendy's. That's not McDonald's." Right? So the same stories get told again and again, just that some of the details change. And so, again, I think what was common to these, to both rumors, to conspiracy theories, to misinformation, is the belief in the face of publicly available evidence that doesn't support the claim. So when I think about, it's sometimes hard that sometimes conspiracy theories turn out to be true. I say the Watergate, cover up of the Nixon administration was a rumor, but then turned out to be true. There were rumors that the CIA in the American case were involved in mind control experiments in the 1950s. These turn out to be true. But what happens is, I think the important distinction is that these rumors, this misinformation, spreads in the absence of confirming evidence. So I think what ties it all together is belief in the face of a lack of evidence there. Now, I think what does change with rumors compared to, say, misinformation is this social transmission that I mentioned before, right? The kind of how they travel. But at the end of the day, right, these are all cases of unsupported beliefs. And it doesn't mean that these beliefs are incorrect, but it does mean that the evidence isn't there to support them.
Professor, you highlight that belief is rumors is often tied to partisan identity. How does political loyalty shape the way individuals accept or reject information?
Mm-hmm. Well, so we know this very much in the U.S. case, is that partisanship plays a huge role in whether or not people believe their kinds of that. In a sense, it's a screen that sort of, if I'm a Democrat, I will tend to believe things about Democrats that paint them in good lights, vice versa for Republicans. And this is true of rumors as well. So in the book, I talk about we can predict whether or not people believe particular political rumors. There's two factors at work there. One is there's a general belief in kind of willingness for conspiratorial thinking, right? So, I would say, think about it at a family holiday. You talk to a relative, they've always got some sort of crazy story. Maybe it's your uncle, maybe it's your cousin. So some people are more likely to believe these stories. But there's also the partisan aspect, where Democrats are more likely to believe crazy stories about Republicans and vice versa. So it's not that, and these two factors come together. So it's not the case that all Republicans think, for example, that Obama was not a citizen, but Republicans who are prone to conspiratorial thinking believe this is the case. On the converse, back in the 2016 election, presidential election in the U.S., there were stories that Donald Trump was an agent of the Russian government, right? Again, it could be that Russia was rooting for Trump in the election, but they weren't directly involved in the election outcome. But if you're a Democrat who scores high on these conspiratorial thinking, right? If you're prone to believe these kinds of crazy stories, then you're more likely to believe them. So partisanship doesn't determine whether or not people believe these stories, but it's a marker of your own interest. And that, I would say, conspiracy theories, political rumors are a combination of conspiratorial thinking and partisan thinking that come together in such that we can see that.
Professor, several chapters in the book draw on original survey and experimental evidence to map who believes which rumor and under what conditions. What did you find most surprising about the patterns of belief you uncovered? Especially the idea that a lot of people believe some conspiracies rather than a small fringe believing many.
Yeah, that's a great question. So going in, I've been studying public opinion for 25 years now, and I know that if you ask a survey question, no matter how crazy, you'll have a certain percentage of people who believe this. So, I say, are witches real? 15 to 20% of people say that they believe that. Does the sun revolve around the earth. 15 to 20% of people believe that. So, one thought is like, well, there's just this group of people who will believe anything. And what's interesting in my work is that by asking a whole bunch of different questions about rumors, ranging from rumors about, as I said, Obama's citizenship to whether or not George Bush stole the 2004 election, to the CIA being involved in running guns and drugs in the inner city. By asking a whole bunch of these questions, I can see what are the kinds of people who believe a lot of these, what are people who believe a few. And so what's interesting to me is that it's true on every question. 15 to 20% of people endorse it, but it's not the same 15 to 20%. Some people, and I do this when I give talks to academic audiences or even lay audiences. I show, here's a list of 8 questions that I ask, and someone invariably says like, well, okay, that all makes sense, except that one story, like that one, that's not a rumor, that's true. And so as I said, if I look at kind of across all these different questions, I find it is the case there are some people who believe a lot of crazy things. So, like your crazy uncle or your crazy cousin, they'll believe everything. That's only a few percentage of people. But it's also the case that 85% of people, when I have these 8 different political rumors, will endorse at least one of them. And so, yes, it's true that, some people believe a lot of crazy things, but it's also important to recognize that lots of people believe some crazy things.
Professor, one of your key insights is that misinformation is not just as a fringe phenomenon. Why do even well-informed or moderate individuals sometimes fall for political rumors?
Yeah. Another great question. I think a lot of this has to do with how people think about politics. So earlier on when we were talking, I mentioned most of the people most of the time don't pay attention to politics. And whenever I talk to audiences, be they my students in classes, or I sometimes talk to MIT alums, or I talk to different civic groups, I always tell people, say, you need to recognize that most people aren't like you. Like, you're here at my talk, and people who tune into your podcast are here because they're interested in politics. But most people aren't, right? Most people, most of the time, would rather talk about something else, right? People would rather hear about the World Cup right now than hear about politics. And that's important to recognize that in this instance, where people are trying to avoid politics, they still have some basic attachments. So in the United States, people pick their political team, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And if I don't pay a lot of attention to politics, I'm going to listen to politicians, right? The people who I know support my view, and let them make my decisions for me, right? And so, it's the case that, that even though, I might not pay a lot of attention, if I'm a Republican, I hear Donald Trump saying, the last election was stolen, the next election will be stolen, voter fraud is everywhere, eventually that's going to sink in. Similarly, if I'm a Democrat and, I hear people alluding to this claim that, the Russian government infiltrated the election, eventually I'm going to believe that there. So a lot of it is this question of, even if I don't pay a lot of attention to politics, I'm going to hear about politics. I'm going to hear about politics from people that I trust. And so that creates this very bad situation where, we call it a top-down sort of model, where you have politicians who are spewing untruths or unsupported claims, and then a large portion of the population who are willing to believe them.
Professor, you emphasize that targeting the undecided is as important as addressing strong believers. How should communication strategies differ between these two groups?
Yeah, no, it's again, it kind of ties into this kind of the most people most of the time not paying attention to politics. And so, when we think about, people who pay a lot of attention, the true believers, that you need to use a different sort of strategy to reach them than people who are just casually paying attention to politics. So, thinking about the kinds of strategies that worry about it in the modern age. So, even if I tried to avoid politics, like even if I just wanted to follow sports or entertainment, in the social media age where information is available, people might be what I call incidentally exposed. So it's sort of, maybe I don't follow politics, but my friends do, and they talk about politics. So I'm kind of seeing it there, and that is something that's really important to recognize, that it's not, sort of one thing I find in the book, that it's really hard to change people's minds, the true believers, but it doesn't mean that we should give up. But it does mean that we want to focus not just on the true believers, but these people who are sort of in the middle, the incidentally exposed, the undecided. And I found that in some of my surveys where I ask people what they believe, I then follow up and say, well, what did you hear that led you to believe this? And sometimes if people say that they're not sure if a rumor is true or not, they'll say, well, I heard, things that said that, like, Obama is a citizen, but, there's so much talk, and where there's smoke, there's fire. There's got to be something there. So I think, sort of in the book, I talk a lot about the importance of focusing on these undecideds, the people who say that they're not sure where they stand, and to recognize that it's sort of that we need to have a softer touch with them, and that, if we sort of come full bore and say, like, oh, there's no evidence for this, right? You're dumb. You're not following politics. Recognize, like, well, that's not the best strategy for these folks. To recognize, if they heard something, we want to correct them, and say, here's the correct information. And again, thinking about this is an ongoing strategy, right? That, if I'm not paying a lot of attention, but maybe I kind of believe something, you give me information to debunk it, you're probably going to have to come back to me again a few weeks later to give me another dose of that, to make sure that, like, okay, right, you're not accepting those rumors.
Professor, in the book, you suggest that who delivers the correction matters as much as the correction itself. What makes a messenger credible enough to change the minds?
Yeah, that's excellent, and I think it's just a very valuable point that I think, as an academic myself, I think that it is kind of hard to get other academics to think this way. But what I'd say is that, it's really important to have experts to determine whether or not claims are supported by evidence. So we want to have journalists doing fact checks to see, someone made a claim, is it supported by the evidence or not? If I'm a scientist, I want someone who has expertise to say, is climate change a real phenomenon or not? Now, these are the people who should determine the truth, to determine the balance of the evidence, but these aren't necessarily the best people to deliver that claim, right? So, being an MIT professor, in some cases that gives me credibility, but in other places in the U.S., they say, like, oh, you're just an egghead, right? I'm not going to believe you. And so I'm not necessarily the best person to deliver a message. Similarly, fact checkers might be the best trained to determine whether or not a claim is supported, but instead, maybe we want to have someone else deliver that message. And so you asked, what gives someone credibility? I can sometimes get credibility because I speak against my apparent interest, right? So in experiments that I ran, there was a notion that there were death panels, and this is sort of saying these were government-run panels that would decide whether or not people get health care, around the Affordable Care Act, which is something that was passed by Congress in 2010 and is the basis of the current healthcare system in the U.S. Now, there are no death panels. There never were death panels. But we found is that the most effective way to dismiss these claims is not by saying that you have Democrats saying, like, oh, there's no death panels. It's Republicans. So these are people who maybe don't support the overall policies, but do claim that there are no death panels. Similarly, if we think about questions of, I talk to doctors sometimes about, what are some strategies we can use to maximize vaccine uptake, right? So to have people taking these, doctors say, that this is best for your health, but some people might claim like, well, you're just working for big pharma, right? Just working for these companies that are making the drugs, and so you're selling them. So better to have someone who is not invested in those interests. So, if there's a rumor that certain vaccines cause autism, right, the best person to debunk that is not someone who is, making them pharmacological companies. It's not doctors who are suggesting this. It's saying perhaps people, parents of children with autism, who might say, "Oh, you might have heard this claim that vaccines cause autism. That's just not true," right? And that's where the credibility comes from. People speaking against their parent interest, but it can also come from a place in a community. So, in the U.S., when there was the rollout of the COVID vaccine, a lot of times people are relying on community leaders. So folks who are trusted in their community, religious leaders, education officials, folks who ordinary people trusted. And so you can get trust that way. So there's lots of different ways to build that trust. But I think the important thing that I say in the book, it's important to separate out the content of the message from the deliverer of that message. And if we want to effectively debunk rumors and debunk misinformation, we need to find the right mix of messenger and message.
Professor, given that many people are not deeply engaged with politics, how
Mm-hmm.
does low political awareness contribute to the spread of misinformation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of it, so we've talked about some of this, but just that, if you don't pay much attention to politics, there's not a lot of context there, right, to understand, well, how do these different things fit together? And so, it's one thing I should say, though, I've said this, sort of several times as we've talked about how most people, most of the time, don't pay attention to politics. That's a perfectly rational thing, So, I'm a political scientist, so I'm kind of a political junkie. But I have friends who are biologists, and maybe they pay attention to politics, but they also have their hobbies, they have their families, they have their financial situations to think about. So it's perfectly rational not to pay attention to politics. But what's really important is to recognize, in that instance where people are just kind of floating along, that they are susceptible to the information that's out there, especially in times where we ask people to make political decisions, right? So, that in the United States in presidential elections, more than 60% of people vote. And that's a much higher percentage than the percentage of people who pay close attention to politics. So it's really important to recognize that even if it's rational to not pay much attention to politics, that decision making under cases where there isn't a lot of information can be tricky, and it can be especially tricky in the case of elections where maybe people are voting not based on their own interests or party ties, but from something that they heard on the internet.
Professor, you point out that political elites sometimes spread or fail to correct misinformation. What responsibility should leaders bear in maintaining informational integrity?
Yeah, that's really the magic question, kind of the toughest question there, right? So I'm a student of mass political behavior. I spend all my time. I was trained to study how do ordinary people think about politics. But the irony is that the big problem right now are not people, but political leaders, right? So people say, well, how can we fix the misinformation problem? I say, well, there's little things that we can do to make people better consumers of information. But these things just work a little bit at the margin, right? If we really want to fix the problem, we need to have better politicians, right? We need to have politicians who won't say unsupported claims. And we need to have other politicians within the same party calling that out, right? So, I worry a lot. We're in an election year here in the U.S. We have the midterm elections coming up. There's a lot of information going around about the prevalence of voter fraud. That just isn't correct. That basically there is almost no voter fraud in the United States. This is a factual matter. Anyone who's investigated it in a serious way has found this is the case. But yet stories still float around there. And so, we just need to have better politicians. The problem, though, is that some politicians have seemed to benefit from having this misinformation out there. And how can we change the incentives for these political elites, for these political leaders? That I don't know. And I wish I had an answer to that question. But that's kind of if we're going to fix it, that's what we really need to do.
Professor, in the later chapters, you shift from diagnosis to solutions,
Mm-hmm.
emphasizing strategies like targeting uncertain citizens and leveraging politically aligned messengers instead of neutral fact checkers. Can you walk us through one or two chapter cases that show when these interventions work and where they fall short in real world settings?
Yeah. Well, so let me talk about the death panels that I mentioned before. So I became, as I said, interested in this about 15 years ago, in part because of these rumors about Obama's citizenship, but also these rumors about death panels. Right, this notion that there were government-run panels to decide whether or not elderly people were to get care, and so in that case, there's a lot of information that was out there saying these didn't exist. And so trying to figure out what are some strategies we could use. And that's where I came up with this idea about having the messenger speaking against their apparent interests. So if we have a Republican politician saying there are no death panels, that's the most effective way to correct that misinformation. That's the most effective way to have people give up the rumor. So that's the success story. The not so good story is that these effects don't last very long, right? And so if I went back to these, so I ran this experiment where I found the most effective was a Republican saying there are no death panels. It would move people's belief, right, that they would be more likely to reject that rumor, more likely to say there are no death panels. But if I go to those same people 2 weeks later, I find that most of that effect has faded, right? And this again gets at the notion of the whack-a-mole, right? That, if a piece of misinformation comes up, I whack it with the truth. But then a couple weeks later, it'll come up again, right? And so it's this ongoing strategy. And so, at the end of the day, when I talk to different groups, I always tell when people bring me in to give a talk, be it doctors or other civic groups, I always say, I know you brought me here because you want me to say, here's the 3 easy things you can do to fix your misinformation problem. And I always say, I can't do that because it doesn't exist. And anyone who tells you they are is a snake oil salesman, right? Someone who shouldn't be believed, a charlatan. And so I'm not that person. And so what I can say is here are things that can work at the margin to make things a little better, right? So I know that correcting, have the right person correcting the misinformation, the right person being the messenger, can make things a little better. It's not going to fix the problem, but at the end of the day, I say, wouldn't we like things to be a little better than they are today, right? We're not going to fix it, but maybe we can make things not quite so bad. And that's not a very inspiring message, I know, but it's realistic. And so kind of thinking about, when I think about misinformation interventions, I think it's really important to think in that way. It's like, what can we do to make things better? And isn't it more so isn't it better to make things a little better than they are today?
Thank you, Professor Adam Berinsky, for sharing such right insights into how political rumors can hold and why they are so hard to dislodge. Your work not only helps us to understand the psychology and politics of misinformation, but also points us toward more thoughtful, research-based ways of responding to it in our own lives and institutions. To our listeners, we hope this conversation encourages you to pause, question, and reflect the next time you encounter a striking political claim, and to think carefully about both the message and the messenger. I'm Deepak, signing you from India. Until next time, stay curious and keep the conversation going. Thank you once again, Professor Adam.
Thank you so much for having me. It was Pleasure talking.